Hello, I'm Dr. Daniel Gottlieb, and I'm a colony manager at the Oregon National Primate Research Center. Thank you for listening. Today I'm going to be talking about a study I did that was published in the American Journal of Primatology titled Personality, Environmental Stressors, and Diarrhea in Rhesus Macaques, an Interactionist Perspective. This study was performed at the California National Primate Research Center, and in this study, we found that a monkey's personality significantly predicted the risk of having diarrhea. We also found a significant interaction between personality and environment, meaning the relationship between personality and diarrhea was dependent on the animal's environment. First, I'm going to explain why we wanted to look at diarrhea in rhesus macaques, and a little bit of background on the relationship between diarrhea and personality. Diarrhea is a common problem in captive rhesus macaques and captive macaques in general, and it's a major welfare concern for colony managers. Monkeys experiencing chronic diarrhea are prone to dehydration, weight loss, and malnutrition, which if untreated can lead to death or in some cases the need for humane euthanasia. Chronic diarrhea-associated mortality in captive macaques reportedly occurs in over 3% of outdoor housed macaques, and in the past it's accounted for up to 34% of non-experimental deaths in some facilities. While there are a lot of different risk factors and predictors for diarrhea in macaques, one common finding is that enteric pathogens are correlated with diarrhea. This includes Campylobacter and Shigella. So why are we interested in stress and diarrhea? Well, multiple studies have shown that risk of diarrhea can be exacerbated by both chronic and acute stressors. Chronic exposure to stress can have generalized immunosuppressive actions on the body, putting individuals at higher risk for gastrointestinal disorders, as well as enteric pathogen colonization and growth. Acute stressors, on the other hand, can increase intestinal mucin and ion secretion, increase epithelial permeability, and induce intestinal inflammation, triggering individual episodes of diarrhea and reactivating pre-existing gastrointestinal disorders. Now let's talk a little bit about personality. Personality can be defined as an individual's basic position towards environmental change and challenge that emerges early in life and typically remains consistent throughout development. Multiple studies have looked at the relationship between personality and diarrhea in humans and have found that humans with personality types that are neurotic, introverted, nervous, and anxious all have a higher risk of having diarrhea. So why would personality predict diarrhea? Well, let's go back to the simplified model of diarrhea that I had earlier, where I showed that both chronic and acute stress can exacerbate diarrhea risk by increasing enteric pathogen growth or by inducing individual episodes of diarrhea. Well, what causes stress? There are often events or environments that will cause stress for an individual. For example, in captive rhesus macaques, they are often relocated from one location to another. This is a particularly stressful event, and by this model, it could increase an individual's risk of having diarrhea. But what's stressful to one individual may not be stressful to another, and that's where personality or temperament comes into play. An event happens, and based on the animal's personality, they can interpret that event as stressful or not. So if an animal has a particularly stress-sensitive personality, and they are relocated multiple times, they'll interpret that as stressful, and it will increase their risk of having diarrhea. If an individual monkey does not have a stress-sensitive personality type, or does not have a personality that interprets many relocations as stressful, these events will not increase their risk of having diarrhea. This study was performed at the California National Primate Research Center on near 2,000 rhesus macaques born between 2001 and 2007. Personality data was taken from a biobehavioral assessment program in which infants between the ages of 90 and 120 days old are brought in for a variety of behavioral and physiological tests. This includes recording of temperament scores, which I'll go into more detail in the next slide. These temperament scores are what we used as our measure of personality and what we used as our predictor for later chronic diarrhea. This is an enormous database of infant monkey personality and health and is a huge resource for the California National Primate Research Center. Investigators doing research on monkeys who went through this program can look back on what their behavior and physiology was back when they were infants and see how that correlates with later study findings. To date, there have been 72 studies that have been published that have used data from the biobehavioral assessment program, and this ranges from studies that have looked at how a mother's milk predicts their infant's temperament to how an infant's temperament predicts their later development of abnormal behaviors. If you think this is interesting, I encourage you to read more about it and find some of these studies. What we're going to do is provide a document that lists all 72 studies to date that have used this data. This document can be found on the American Society of Primatologists website in the Hot Topics in Animal Welfare section, specifically on the page that discusses the study I'm talking about today. Like I said, we use this biobehavioral assessment program and the temperament scores recorded as some of our predictors for personality in this diarrhea study. There were 4 major temperament scores that we used. These include gentle, how gentle and calm the individual monkey was during the testing program. Vigilant, if the monkeys were hyper aware of their surroundings, and if they were not tense and timid during the testing. Confident, these are monkeys who were confident and bold. And nervous, these are monkeys who were particularly nervous and fearful and not calm during the testing program. I'm now going to go over a selected portion of the results from our study. If you find this interesting, I encourage you to find the whole study in the American Journal of Primatology. First, I'm going to discuss chronic diarrhea. This means what was an animal's risk of having multiple episodes of diarrhea after they had their first bout. Did they have diarrhea once and then they were done? Or did they have multiple repeated episodes? We're going to look at all 4 temperament measures I discussed before. On the y-axis, we have the expected count of diarrhea over the course of 2 years. And when I say expected count, this means number of cases of diarrhea that needed a clinical case opened at the Primate Center. On the x-axis, we have the animal's relative temperament score, so they could be low on any given temperament, all the way up to being high, higher than the average monkey for, in this case, a nervous temperament. Now let me walk you through what one of these figures looks like. Here highlighted is a monkey who was low on the nervous temperament, and they were expected to have only a few bouts of diarrhea over the course of the study. The higher their nervous temperament score, the more expected cases of diarrhea we expected to see in the study. On the flip side, here highlighted is a monkey who's low on a confident temperament score, and as you can see, they're expected to have a high amount of diarrhea over the course of the study. The higher their confident temperament score, the lower the amount of diarrhea they're expected to have. So what we found was monkeys with the highest risk for chronic diarrhea were monkeys who were nervous, gentle, vigilant, meaning hyper-aware of their surroundings, and not confident. This is actually fairly analogous to the human literature that found that individuals who have the highest risk of chronic diarrhea are individuals who are neurotic, introverted, nervous, and anxious. And while this might seem pretty simple and straightforward, it gets a lot more complicated when we talk about diarrhea risk. Diarrhea risk refers to an individual's risk of having diarrhea at all over the course of the study. Some monkeys had diarrhea multiple times, as we just saw, but some didn't have it at all. So here we're looking at, did they even have diarrhea once? What we found was that relocations, which as I discussed before is when a monkey moves from one location to another and is a particularly stressful event, this positively predicted diarrhea. It's what we expected. Environmental stressors predicted diarrhea risk. What's interesting is we found no significant main effect for temperament. So temperament alone did not predict actual diarrhea risk. We did, however, find a significant interaction between temperament and environment. This figure gets a little bit more complicated. Here on the y-axis, we have an individual's risk of having a clinical case of diarrhea over the course of the study. On the x-axis, we have the total number of relocations the individual had over the course of the study. What I want to point out, this highlighted line represents the average number of relocations. On average, monkeys on our study had just over 4 relocations. Each figure here has 3 different colored lines, and they represent various different temperament scores. So a green line represents a monkey who was relatively low for a given temperament, the blue line represents monkeys who were average for a given temperament, and the purple line represents monkeys who were relatively high for a given temperament. So highlighted here are monkeys who were high for the nervous temperament score. As you can see, monkeys who were high for the nervous temperament and had a low number of relocations had a relatively low risk of having diarrhea. The more relocations they had, the higher their risk of having diarrhea. If we look at monkeys who were average, once again, if they had a low number of relocations, a low risk of having diarrhea, and the more relocations they had, the higher their risk. Monkeys who had a low nervous temperament, once again, a low number of relocations, a low risk of having diarrhea. But as these monkeys had more relocations, they had a much higher increased risk of having diarrhea. So what we're seeing is monkeys with a low nervous temperament score are much more influenced by having multiple relocations than a monkey with a high nervous temperament score. Something I want to point out is that if a monkey had the average number of relocations, there was almost no effect of their nervous temperament score. So here we look at the average number of relocations, and monkeys with a low, average, or high nervous temperament score all had the same risk of having an episode of diarrhea. And this is the case for all 4 temperament measures. If we look at monkeys who had a few number of relocations, there's an effective temperament score, but it's relatively small. It's only when we look at what I call the high-risk environments in which monkeys were relocated multiple times, which is particularly stressful, that we saw a major effect of their temperament scores. So the question then becomes, who thrived in this high-risk environment? In environments where monkeys had multiple stressful relocations, what were the personality types who had the lowest risk of having an episode of diarrhea? We found the lowest risk of diarrhea were monkeys who were nervous, vigilant, gentle, and not confident. If you're paying attention, this is going to be a little surprising because this is opposite of our previous results. We found that in monkeys who had diarrhea at least once, they were at highest risk of having chronic diarrhea with these same personality types. Chronic diarrhea was seen in monkeys who were nervous, vigilant, gentle, and not confident. But what we're seeing here is in a really high-risk environment, these are actually beneficial personality types. When you're having monkeys have lots of relocations, it's good to be nervous, vigilant, gentle, and not confident. So once again, while this personality type means a monkey is at higher risk for chronic diarrhea, it can be beneficial in certain environments, in particular, this high-stress, frequent relocation environment. So what are the colony management implications here? Well, broadly speaking, we want to avoid placing animals in environments in which we know they're high risk for negative health outcomes. In this case, single episodes of clinical cases of diarrhea or chronic clinical cases of diarrhea. If an animal is in an environment where they're at high risk, they should receive increased monitoring so we can make sure the animal is doing okay. That being said, I want to be practical and recognize that this isn't something that's always easy to implement. When we're creating social groups and we're determining what personality types can go into a social group, there are many different considerations. We have to look at the genetics of the animals. We have to look at what projects the animals might be used for, their familial relationships, who gets along with who has good social experience. So while we might want to look at temperament and pick the best temperaments for the lowest risk of having diarrhea, that's one of many considerations. Also, if you're going to be doing something like this, you need a huge, massive database on temperament to be able to select your animals. A place like California has a database like this, but most centers don't. So the only way something like this is going to be relatively practical is if you have a huge database, or if you're a small enough center where you can get temperament scores on all monkeys you're considering. If you find this interesting and you want to learn more about how temperament can influence colony management decisions, what I have up here are some suggested selected readings where studies were done to look at how temperament could be used to inform our colony management choices. I would like to thank the California National Primate Research Center for supporting this study, our various funding sources, and the American Journal of Primatology for publishing the full study. Finally, I'd like to thank the American Society of Primatologists for featuring this study in their Hot Topics in Animal Welfare. If you enjoyed this talk, I encourage you to find the full published study in the American Journal of Primatology. As I said before, I only talked about some of the highlighted results, so there's more to discover in the full paper. Thank you very much for listening.